Welcome to the summit. My name is Jill King. I'm a librarian at the DePaul University Library, and I will be moderating today's session. Just a couple quick reminders as we get started. Please do stay on mute during the presentation. The chat will remain open, and you're welcome to share comments or questions or feedback there. And we will have time at the end of the session for questions. All right, so we'll get started right away. I'm very pleased to introduce Grace Overbeke, Assistant Professor of Theater at Columbia College Chicago, and her presentation, Charting the Ecosystem of Chicago Comedy. Thanks for joining us, Grace. I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Jill, and to everyone at the Chicago Research Summit for having me. Today, I'm going to present a little bit about a course that I am now teaching for the second time, but is very much a work in progress here at Columbia College Chicago. It is called Charting the Ecosystem of Chicago Comedy. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the flipped classroom. Last year, during the pandemic, was a banner year for online, remote, and asynchronous teaching and learning, reviving interest in the flipped classroom model. In 2006, two high school teachers, Jonathan Bergman and Aaron Sams, popularized the flipped classroom model, in which instead of receiving content in class in like a lecture style and then applying that content to assignments at home, the students reviewed the content at home, often online in the form of video lectures or digitized recordings or viewings, and then spent the class period applying that content through exercises and problem-solving technique. One of the advantages that the flipped classroom offers is its similarity to the lab model in the sciences. Students are conducting research along with their peers and with the instructor, allowing for more active collaboration and development of a classroom community. One of Columbia College's core classes is the Chicago Communities class, which second-year students take, focusing on exploring the city around us as a way of developing skills in researching, documenting, and critically reflecting on the creative ecosystem of a community. So in this presentation, I'm going to share a little bit about a course that I'm developing, exploring the form of the flipped classroom and the content of the ever-changing world of professional comedy in Chicago. So rather than begin the course with traditional learning objectives, in other words, by the end of this class, the student will be able to X, Y, Z. My starting point was a series of research questions, which would be explored along with the students through a series of in-class research projects. So the research questions that started off the class were, in what ways has comedy been viewed as inferior to tragedy? How has it impacted what the major professional theaters in Chicago program in their main stage seasons? Why did some comedians in Chicago feel the need to go underground, and what sets the underground comedy scene apart from the above ground comedy scene, both aesthetically, economically, in a number of ways? The third question was, how do comedy festivals develop networks between industry professionals and local comedians? And do comedy festivals enhance or detract from developing a kind of distinctive Chicago-based comedy culture? Fourth question, what makes Chicago comedy distinctive? How does the comedy industry connect to other industries in Chicago? And lastly, how has Chicago's comedy scene impacted the larger comedy landscape, nationally, globally? And how can we show this influence visually using digital mapping techniques? So ultimately, these questions kind of broke down into 5 major spheres of the Chicago comedy scene. There's the scene of what some people call the legitimate theater, your major theaters like the Steppenwolfs, the Goodmans. Then there's the comedy clubs and improv clubs like your Second City, like your Zanies, like IO. Then there's the underground comedy scene, like all of your open mics, anytime there's a show at a bar or in a church basement. Then there's the comedy festivals. And lastly, there's the symbiotic relationship between comedy and corporate partnerships. So you have things like Second City, which has a whole wing of Second City, which is just developed just about partnering with different businesses. You have Wavelength and other companies that are about fusing education and comedy. So you have this whole element of Chicago's comedy world that is about what I call comedy crossover. It's using the skills that you develop as a comedian to partner with and collaborate with other industries. So looking at these spheres, there were a lot of members of the community of Chicago comedy who volunteered their time, both on Zoom and in person, to speak to the class. I found that this element of research, which anyone who's done contemporary research will say, like, interviews are an indispensable part of that research. And so a major component of the class is conducting these in-person interviews. And sometimes the in-person interviews take place, on Zoom. Certainly that was the case last year. But this year, more and more, we're doing these in-person interviews literally in person. So either we will invite the speakers to Columbia's classroom and we'll sit down and talk there, or we will go on a field trip. And that way we can both interview the guest speaker and also get a stronger sense of the venue, of the world that they are building. So this year, there are 3 on-site visits that we've done. The first was to the Annoyance Comedy Club. The second was to Second City's campus. And the third will be to Zany's Comedy Club. And we do treat these field trips very much like on-site visits. So we're not only doing the interview, but also really looking around and sort of taking detailed sort of ethnographic notes about what is not just the seating capacity and the sort of like logistical elements of the venue, but what is the first impression? What kind of language do they use in their marketing? What kind of architectural features do they foreground? So the idea is that students can really sort of understand the venue from an experience standpoint, rather than simply learning about it in books. So we have been very fortunate in the number of people who have been willing to do in-person interviews and host us. Polly Hubbard is the director of new play development at Steppenwolf Theater. So she was able to provide a really exciting glimpse into the legitimate theater world and how someone selects what plays to do. Obviously, she's speaking specifically from Steppenwolf, but it's a great way to get students thinking about how theaters program a season and what is the relationship between comedy and the programming that they're going to see at one of the sort of major regional theaters in the city. We also got to speak with Mick Napier and Jennifer Eslin, who founded the Annoyance Theater and Bar. Additionally, we spoke to Raymond Lambert, who was the founder of the sadly now closed club, All Jokes Aside. We spoke with Ann Libera, who is the director of Comedy Studies, which is a program linking Columbia College with Second City. Additionally, we spoke to Matt Griffo, who is a comedian in the underground scene of Chicago. Rick Walker, who worked with Wavelength, which is one of the troupes that partners comedians with different school systems and also with corporations throughout the Chicago area. And with Jill Valentine, who was the executive producer of 2 sketch festivals, or 2 festivals of comedy in Chicago, both the Chicago Sketch Comedy Festival and the Chicago Women's Funny Fest. So representing the sort of legitimate theater view, we had Polly Hubbard. Representing improv comedy clubs, we had Mick Napier and Jennifer Eslin, and Libera and Raymond Lambert. Representing underground comedy, we had Matt Griffo. Representing corporate partnerships, we had Rick Walker, and representing festivals, we had Jill Valentine. So let's move on to some of the research tasks. As I mentioned, it's a flipped classroom, which means that for each of these spheres, we had time together to do a kind of in-class project, allowing us to really kind of get some hard data about the different spheres, to try to address the different questions that the course was based on. So to address the question of, is there a bias against comedy in the Chicago theater world? Students were put into small groups, and each group was given a different major theater in Chicago. And basically what their task was to go through that theater's production history for the last 5 years and chart how many productions they did, and of those productions, how many were comedies. And that was really the ultimate research task, was because it's difficult to know what is and is not a comedy based on a production history. So they had to dig a little deeper and look into the show and figure out both, was it a comedy, and also was it represented as a comedy? So we found some of the data, which we replicated this year pretty closely. The Red Orchid Theater has done 23 shows, 5 of which were comedies. Looking Glass Theater has done 15 shows, 4 of which were comedies. The Goodman Theater has done 34 shows, 8 of which were comedies. Court Theater, 18 shows, 0 comedies. Several were sort of dramedies, like they were walking the line. But what the students noticed is that there was no, they didn't use language of comedies in the billing. Like when they're trying to get people to come, they would not use language like funny or comical or amusing. Like anything that is that paints it as a comedy was not present in the marketing literature. Timeline Theater Company, 12 shows, 2 of which were comedies, and Remy Bumpo, 16 shows, 6 comedies. So what they found, and this is just a sample of the data, but what they found is that indeed, within Chicago's so-called legitimate theater, there does seem to be either a bias against comedy or a bias against advertising their shows using language that paints it as comedy. One of the tasks that we did to look at the improv and comedy clubs was focused on Raymond Lambert. And all jokes aside, we were discussing, what does it mean? Like, all jokes aside was a comedy club that ran from it closed down in 2009, and it was really kind of the jumping off point for almost every major Black comedian who is active today. It's, Bernie Mac performed there, Dave Chappelle performed there, Cedric the Entertainer performed there, Steve Harvey. It's a who's who of Black comedians in Chicago, but also in the world. And it was very much, it was quite unique. So the question we raised was, what is there, if anything, in today's Chicago comedy landscape that is filling that niche? Is there a place that is a comedy club specifically celebrating Black comedians and aimed towards a Black audience? And we spent some time researching that question, looking into contemporary forums, whether they're open mic nights or troupes that focus on Black improvisers, just looking like, what are the places that you can go today if you want to celebrate Black comedians? And this was a rather demoralizing research project, because what we found was that there are very, very few contemporary forums. There are some, And I think it was a useful project to compile them so that if you want to, you now have this resource list of places you can go to support Black comedians. But the real takeaway from that particular assignment was that the closure of All Jokes Aside has resulted in a need that has not really been met since it closed. To discuss the underground comedy scene, students did a project where they were given a hypothetical budget and they had to then research how much it would cost to use that imaginary budget to stage an underground comedy show. So the assignment was, imagine you and your group members have $1,500 to produce a one-night only do-it-yourself underground comedy show. Create a budget, specifying all the expenses involved. Consider publicity, performers, venue, sound equipment, someone to run it, tickets, house management. And so the research was really, how much does it cost to rent microphones? How much does it cost to sign up with a box office service? Like really costing out the elements that are needed for an underground comedy show. And lastly, we did a final project that was about mapping Chicago comedy using this digital humanities technology. So we were creating a map in which each students worked in partners, and each pair selected a venue that is part of the Chicago comedy scene that we had not yet covered in class, something we hadn't researched together, and did an individual research project making a video about this comedy venue. So if time allows, I'd love to play one of the examples of the videos the students made. The idea is that the ultimate creation is a kind of comedy tour, so that there's a map and you can click around on the map and different videos will pop up, giving the tourist different pictures of comedy in Chicago. So without further ado, I'll share one of the videos. Can everyone, let's see. Okay, can everyone see this screen that says Batsu? Okay.
Yes, thanks.
Batsu by Sky Crumpler and Baxter Spark. Batsu information. Batsu is located at 1531 North Wells Street. 4 warriors compete in comedic challenges to avoid electric shocks, paintballs, a giant egg-smashing chicken, and many more hilarious and jaw-dropping punishments. Batsu takes place in a beautiful lounge theater with Kamahachi, Chicago's original sushi bar since 1967, in the heart of Old Town. A full menu/bar is available and audience members enjoy sushi and sake, while the bravest may even sign up for a chance to participate to win free beer and prizes.
It was founded in 2016 by Brian Walters and his improv group Face Off Unlimited. It's located in the Kamahachi restaurant, and the patrons are served by something called a sake ninja. Audience members can also participate in the challenges on stage, given that they sign a waiver. They can win free beer and prizes from this, or punishments. Brian Walters is the only real notable alumni we could find, but he was on Epic Rap Battles in History as Ash Ketchum. That's about it. Here's a picture we took.
We hope you like it.
They were closed and somewhat rude to us, so we just took a picture and left.
Wow.
Here's a 5-star review.
Went to Batsu for the first time this post-weekend, and I have to say, simply, wow. Probably the most entertaining show I've ever seen on stage in Chicago. The whole concept was confusing at first, but once the games had truly begun, it was fantastic. So ridiculous and fun in all the right ways. I highly recommend going with a group of friends and volunteering for anything they ask of you. Such a great time, and we'll be going again for sure.
Thanks, Kyle B. Here's a trailer from their official YouTube channel.
This is what happens when American comedians wake up.
So because of time, I'm not actually going to show the whole thing, but what I wanted to, I'll just summarize. What the group does an excellent job of doing is they give a little bit of background information. When was it founded? Who is it run by? That kind of thing. Then they show some footage from one of their performances, and then they actually deconstruct the performance in terms of the way that it gives a problematic rendition of Japanese culture in sort of being appropriated by these white comedians. So within this, 6-minute video, they both inform and also deconstruct and analyze this comedy venue. And it's a whole map of that. You can basically just click throughout Chicago and see a breakdown of different venues that are both, you get the little capsule, like, what is this place? And then you get a really interesting analysis based on the students' reading. So I do want to leave some time for questions. So thank you for listening to my experiences, and I would love to chat.
Thank you so much, Grace.
Well, thank you.
If anyone has questions, yeah, you can go ahead and type them into the chat, or we're, not such a large group that, I think you should feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask a question as well if you'd like to talk more. And Grace, it sounds like the students did a lot in this class too. Did you say you're teaching the class now this quarter, right? And then did you previously teach it?
I taught
online?
it, yes. So I taught, and there's such a irony in teaching a class that is about developing community online, because it really does stretch what exactly is possible. So this is the second time that I'm teaching it, this time in person. Hi.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you, Grace. Thanks a lot. That was great. I have a question. Just thinking in terms of, so you taught for the first time last semester, last spring. Is that right? You're teaching it again, and I think the first time around. Here's what I'm trying to say. I guess the students are. And you are probably discovering new places and new things in Chicago. And at some point that hits an end, right? So there'll be there'll be no more comedy clubs to discover, to map. So what does one do then? Do you build on that? Like, so you're creating this whole map. And so do you have a conception of how to take that to the next level after everybody's looked and sort of run out of places to put on the map?
Absolutely. Well, so part of that is that just like Chicago is always changing, the map will always change. So like right now we need to change a number of things, like IO was shut down. So that needs to come off the map, but also it's possibly reopening again. So there's the changes that we'll need to account for, but also I think that we can broaden it from specific comedy venues, which is currently what we're mapping, to, and this is what I'm really excited about, mapping things that are not traditionally, that are not obvious. So mapping individual comedians. So rather than like, this is a comedy club, what about the comedian? And also what about like broadening the idea of community so that we're thinking about like the people who are custodians for comedy clubs. Are they not part of the comedy community, given that they get their paychecks from a comedy club and spend their livelihood around comedy, or they spend all of their time around comedy? And really putting people on the map who you might not initially think of putting on the map, because although you might not initially think of them as part of this community, their lives are very bound up in it.
Yeah, and it makes me think of, so I happen to know the person who, at least for a really long time, was a stage manager at Zanies. Mm-hmm. Jenna, do you know Jenna?
No.
Okay. So do you know those? Okay. So, and it makes me think then that there's a possibility of getting to the point where you're interviewing people like that who've done those jobs a long time. And like Jenna has done a lot of drag in the Drag King, and does a lot of humor in that work.
Well,
There's
that's
a lot
what
of humor and drag that isn't comedy per se, but that has me totally understand how this can just explode. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. And it's funny, when I initially planned this course, it had a pretty sizable drag component because I see that as a major part of the comedy landscape. And then because Columbia, as you know, offers this course in drag performance, the idea was maybe scale that back so there's not quite as much overlap. But absolutely, I think that is going to come and as part of the mapping project.
Well, since they're the same class, you could overlap more because students aren't going to take it again.
That's what I was going to say, Grace.
Yeah,
They're
I
the
mean,
same
I
class,
think
so
you could.
don't worry about that.
And I'm sorry to sort of get Columbia focused now for the other people listening, but it's kind of a curricular issue, right? You don't want to do that when there's a chance that they could take that other class, but in this scenario, they kind of can't take that other class. This fulfills it, and then they're done. So the content coming through this particular version of this course, it would be fine.
That's very exciting.
Yeah. Hey, hi, Grace. It's Brian. Yeah, I'm also, really, I mean, it's really beautiful, fabulous work. I'm also thinking about, because these are young comedians. Well, some of them are young comedians, right? Or want to be, but just also the map of, and you mentioned it, right? With, with like Bernie Mac and all the people who've like come through that particular club is like of also mapping the journey between, from, oh, this person is doing IO, but also doing stand up and also works as a custodian or a box office person. That, you know what I mean? Like to just sort of map how people are existing within the comedy world, right? Individual stories might be another layer. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's something that I need to talk to, because network mapping is different from, and it requires a different kind of software. So there is a little bit of a learning curve for me to just, get that software, but I do think that it's a crucial step in this kind of work.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks.
Here. So I had a similar, well, it's sort of a different question. Did you also look at sort of colleges and high schools often have comedy clubs and comedy performances, which are not on the main stages? And so just thinking about that, like I know when you mentioned Court Theater, there are at least when I was an undergrad, there were many, many comedy clubs that were separate from the main stage venues. So thinking on that sense, what about, they're not underground, but they're not necessarily a main stage production?
That's a great point. That had not occurred to me. No, but thank you. That's a fantastic thing to include. Are there other questions? I know that it's 2:00, so we might need to let people go to their next session. But if you have,
it looks like we're right at time. This was such a great conversation, and thanks so much again, Grace, for sharing your work with us. It's a really
if you want
interesting
to
project.
follow up, I've just put my email in the chat, so feel free to reach out.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.